Hello everyone. Today's lesson is going to be on a type of a flower that is called the Valentino rose. And I've done several examples and variations so that you can see how you can create your own flower from this type of process. So I have notes in our blackboard, and as I mentioned, Valentino rose is what it's called after the design of Valentino, but some people say that it's an influence for a carnation flower or a rose. And how we go about creating the flower is there's a pattern that you can create. I've made it about 36 inches long, 35 to 36 inches long. It's about 4.5 inches wide, and you cut it on the bias, and then after you have your fabric on the bias, you fold it in half. That's one way to do it, and put 2 rows of gathering stitch along the raw edge, or maybe along the folded edge, depending on the effects that you want. You gather up the fabric, and then you form it into a rose or a flower. And this is the process for this. And if you are doing some wrapping of the flower in a very concentric fashion, you'll get something that looks like that. But if you add a little bit more fullness to it, and maybe even add more fabric to it in terms of having it wrapped with 2 different kinds of fabric, you could get this kind of an effect. And here's another one with the same fabric but wrapped a little bit more tightly, and so it's a smaller presentation. I've done this in satin as well, and you can see with the satin fabric as opposed to an organza fabric, you get nice full presentation here as well. And instead of wrapping it concentrically, wrapping it consistently around itself, in this case I wrapped it around, and then when I got to a certain point in the flower, I folded it back and wrapped it in the opposite direction. So that's another possibility for adding some more fullness to your flower. But you're the designer, so you're the one who's going to decide on how you're going to be doing this. Now, other variations, depending on the fabric that you're using, I've used a stiff kind of organdy fabric, and put a lot of gathers in it, so it renders a full of fabric, a full of flower. I've also used a gingham kind of organza fabric, and coupled that with a little bit of a sort of a netting nylon fabric, and added a little center to it. And instead of having the folded edge here on the outside edge, I've used the raw edge on the outside, and I've pinked it with my pinking shears, so it creates a little bit of a different effect. I've also added some lace to the outside edge before I roll the fabric up, so that's another possibility. Before you actually gather up your fabric, you can add some lace to the outside edge. I've added it here to the folded edge, just machine stitched it on. Something else that can be done to create the flower is using the 2 raw edges, and if you have access to a purl stitch machine, or if your home machine does a nice close zigzag stitch, you could finish off the edge of the flower that way. And so this is how this one was done, and it's a nice full presentation. And I've done it in a fabric called Dotted Swiss, which has little dots that are sort of felted onto the material. And I've done it in netting. I've cut it longer than the 36 inches for the netting, and I've doubled it up for the netting as well, so otherwise it's just a little bit too skimpy. And in order to get it to be a certain shape, what I did was I took a pair of scissors and I kind of trimmed this to give it a little bit more shaping as well. And with the netting, I also combined it with a piece of organza. So I have the netting and the organza combined, and you can see what a big luscious flower you get that way as well. So you get a nice full flower. And if you don't wrap it up too tightly, you could get a little bit of a flatter presentation where it kind of renders a platform for perhaps another flower that you would center in it. And then you could also have that as a flatter presentation on a garment so that you could stitch that to the garment. So how do we go about making this flower? I'll be right back to show you how we go about doing that. Okay, so here's the pattern piece that I use to create the flower. I have it folded in half, but when I open it up, the pattern piece is about 36 inches long, and it's about 4.5 inches wide, and this pattern piece is cut on the bias. So I have a couple of pieces of fabric that I've already cut out. Here is the organza, and this is typical Valentino. He used silk organza to make his Valentino rose. And so that's one possibility, to use the organza. Again, it is cut on the bias, so it has stretch to it. You could also use other fabrics. So you could play around with the fabrics that you are using for this flower. So see what looks good. Experiment. Or you could use two fabrics. In this case, I have two pieces of organza. One is white and the other one is black. And I've just laid them on top of one another and basted them in the center. And then I will continue with my row of double stitching and then twist that into a flower. Or you could use netting. And as I mentioned with the netting, if I was going to be cutting netting, I would use double layers, maybe even triple layers of the netting, and perhaps go longer than the 36 inches on the pattern, so that you have more fullness to the flower. Because working with the netting or tulle is like working with air. So after you have your flower, your pattern cut, your fabric cut, then fold it in half. And what I've done with this one is I have put my 2 rows of stitching along the raw edge. So my fold in half is a fold line here, and then I have my 2 rows of stitching along the raw edge. And I've left myself sufficient amount of thread here so I can gather it. And I'm using a gathering stitch. I'm not going with the largest stitch on the machine. I'm going with maybe 6 or 7 stitches per inch, as opposed to maybe 5 stitches per inch, so that the gathering stays where I've put it. And I'm marking where the center of my fabric is, so that I have a pin in the center, so that if I wanted to evenly distribute this gather on either side of center, I'll know where the center is once I start gathering. So I've done some gathering already. I've gathered some of the fabric that I've had, and here I have a nice piece of satin organza, and I've cut that out according to my pattern, and I've folded it in half, and I've done my 2 rows of stitching along my raw edge here on the fabric. And I've put a lot of gathering in this. I've gathered it down to a little more than 12 inches. So I've gathered up about to 1/3 of its full length on this. And I could gather it up some more, but I like to test what this might possibly turn out looking like before I actually start sewing it together. And in order to do that, I just start to form a core. So I wrap the fabric around itself, and as I'm wrapping it around itself, what I want to make sure that I'm doing is that I'm placing the gathering stitch on top of itself as I'm making the flower. Now, what would happen if I didn't? Well, you end up with something that starts to look like it's doing that. And I don't know, what is that? Is that an ice cream pop or what, you know? So you don't want that. You want a flower. You don't want something that looks like that. So in order to avoid that, what I do is I wrap it so that the gathering stitch is on top of itself. And this is just to get an idea of what my flower is going to look like. So I'm going to continue wrapping this, and this is going to come out looking quite concentric. And I have a lot of gathering on here. But here's what it would look like if I didn't add any more gathering to it. So you can see that that's a decent looking rose, and certainly if I had something like that growing in my garden, I would be just so thrilled. That would be a beautiful rose to see on a bush or on a garment or in a bouquet, wherever you're going to be using it. But if I wanted to have it more full than that, and not so, I mean, it's all concentric, it's all going around the center, but you could do some adding more fullness to this to give it a little bit more variation. Right now it looks kind of mesmerizing as your eyes try to follow it around. So if I open it up, just to give myself another option here, and I'll open it up again because I haven't stitched anything, and as I'm rolling it around itself, if I give it a little bit of a pleat or more gathering in certain areas, you can see it starts to build out. And it may get a little bit less manageable in terms of holding it all together, but until you can get an idea of what it's going to be looking like if you added more fullness to it, and you know, you could have something more like that, where it's quite full, depending on how much gathering you're going to be adding. So it's up to you to kind of play around with it and see what you want it to ultimately look like, and how full you want it to be, as to how much gathering you should be adding to this flower. So what I do also with these is if someone's going to be holding them, or even if you're going to be taking it and pinning it onto a garment, it might be nice if you try to make it look a little bit more realistic. So there are little crafty items that you could pick up in a craft store that might create a center on the flower for you. And pistils and stamens, you might remember those terminologies from your biology class. That's what you could possibly put in the center of the flower. Otherwise, you could put a button or a jewel or large pearl, bead, or some kind of center in the flower, just to give it a little bit more of a definition of where the center is. And what I like to do is, if I'm going to prepare a bouquet that someone's going to be holding, then I like to use some wire, some stem wire. And this also is available in craft stores, stem wire. I generally get 22 gauge because it's not too heavy and it's easy enough to work with. And this is how I work with it. I take the stem wire and I take a couple of these stamens and pistils, and I fold them in half, and I put the stem wire in between all of them and fold that in half as well. And then I use my pliers, and it's good to have a pair of pliers. You might have one of these around where you keep your tools. Sometimes we're going through a lot of thicknesses of fabric and it gets a little difficult to pull the needles through, so the pliers can help. It'll save your hands. You don't have to struggle with it. But once I have my wire around the stamens, then to just stabilize them, I kind of clip the stamens around, the wire around the stamens, and give it a little bit of security that way, so that they're more stable and they stop flopping around. So that's something that you can do to create a center. And if you want to give it a nice neat finish here, you could use some tubing, and you could insert the end of your wire into the tubing. Just fold the wire over so you have a nice smooth end to go through the tubing, and as you push it through, you can bring that up around the stamens so that it even secures them a little bit more. And then you'll have a nice stem to work with if you're going to make this some kind of a flower that is going to be held. And then we can work with wrapping our flower around the, or fabric around this whole presentation here. So I have one of these as well, and I'm going to just take another one of the fabrics that I've worked with, and here once again you can see that I have this gathered up to about 12 inches once again, and in this case I'm using 2 pieces of fabric. So I have a piece of chiffon or organza. I have the organza, and I have it wrapped around another piece of fabric that's inside there, another piece of silk. And so I'm going to gather this around my stem here so that I have it stabilized. Again, this is your option. You don't have to wrap it around the stem. You can just wrap it around itself. But you need to form a core so that you can have this in place. So as I start to wrap this around, and then what I'm going to do, and I've already kind of played with this fabric, so I know that if I continue wrapping it in this fashion, that I have it gathered enough that when I'm wrapping, it's going to give me a rose that looks like it's opening up. And that's what I want here. I want something that's going to get nice and full like that. So I'm going to go back to the center. And I have that long thread here. I'm not going to cut it just yet, but it does get in the way. And I'm going to use a needle that I've threaded, and I'm going to start to put this together. So I have my needle threaded, and what I would do is look for a needle in your stash that is a little bit thicker than most of your other needles, but not terribly thick, because the thicker the needle, the more difficult it's going to be going through all of this material. But I'm going to go through, and I have a knot in my needle, and I have a double thread here that I'm using as well. So I'm going through the edge of the fabric, and this is called a stab stitch because I'm just I'm stabbing it through all of this, and just to try to keep the threads out of the way. I'm going to cut this other long thread. I don't think I'm going to be using it, not quite all of it anyway. And I'm going to wrap this again, and keep your thread on the bottom of your work here. And again, remember to keep your gathering on top of itself. And when you get it wrapped a little bit more, once again, then go through. And you want to make sure that you're holding all of this together. So go through the edge. You have to grab it from the other end. And then I'm going to wrap it again. to stab through this once again, and you can see I've got a lot here to stab through. Now, if it gets difficult to pull your needle through, use your pliers. And don't be stingy on the stab stitching, because you want to go through all the layers of your gathering when you're doing this. Otherwise, your flower's going to pop apart. And you know, people like to touch these things, so you don't want them to be having the flower fall apart while their hands are right around it. So here again, if it gets too hard to pull the needle through, just use your pliers and pull it tight, and then continue wrapping. And you can see as I'm wrapping, I have all my gathering stitch on top of itself. And I'm going to push the needle through all of this. And I continue doing this until I have all of my flower or fabric wrapped around and creating the flower that I want to create. So I'm going to finish this off camera, and I'll come back when I have it sufficiently threaded and stab stitched on the bottom, and then I'll show you how you can finish off the bottom edge. So I'll be back. Okay, so I've finished wrapping the fabric around my center and my stem, and that's what the underside looks like, and that's a lot of the thread work showing and everything, so you really don't want to see all of that on the underside. So what you can do to cover up all that stitching, whether you have it on a stem or you're just going to pin it onto the garment, it's nice if you can finish off the bottom edge. So you want to cut a little circle of fabric, as we have here. So I have a circle of fabric, and I've done a running stitch around the outside edge of the fabric. And what I'll do here is, and how big should the circle be? Well, you can kind of measure what the diameter is of the underside of your fabric, your flower, and this one's about 1 inch, and I'd add another 1/2 inch to that. So make the diameter of your circle about 1.5 inches for something that might be 1 inch in diameter. And then what you'll do is you're going to do that running stitch all around the edge of your circle. So you'll have a plain running stitch, do it by hand, and then you're going to pull that running stitch until your circle starts to cup in on itself, which it will do. And then you'll take that little cupped circle and you'll cover all of that stitching on the bottom of your flower, and then pin it in place and pin the raw edge in, and just get it to cover all of that machine stitching and hand stitching that was done, so that you have a nice clean finish on the bottom of your flower. And then we'll do a stitch to hold it in place. So you can do a little whip stitch to hold it in place, or a fell stitch to hold it in place, and then you'll have a nice clean finish to the bottom of your flower, so that it'll be suitable to be pinned now or stitched onto wherever you're going to be placing it on your garment or whatever else you might be doing with it. So that's how we can do the Valentino rose or carnation, and that would be one of the choices that you'll have in terms of making a flower. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this presentation.